So what my goal today is to be able to kind of take you through a journey of data discovery that I've had over the last 20 years or so in performance and eye tracking. To be able to do that, I want to tell you and provide you a little context on some of my background. I'm originally from Australia. I do say gala instead of gala. This is me at 9 years old, looking very ferocious on the tennis court. I was a professional tennis player. This is me growing up, playing tennis in Australia. I originally came to the United States on a college scholarship and played professionally after that for a couple of years on the tennis circuit. After I finished playing professionally, I then went and transitioned into coaching and coached a lot in NCAA, but also coached some Paralympic wheelchair tennis athletes, some junior US Open and Wimbledon champions, and was the youngest female coach in NCAA Division I history at the time. And as I was coaching, I started to look at things a little bit differently and ended up going back to school. And in one of my first classes in my doctorate, which was in motor learning, I read a paragraph in a textbook. And essentially what this paragraph says is that visual search in soccer players involves anticipating where a pass will go. And at that time, some of the research was showing that experienced players versus inexperienced soccer players look at different cues in their environment in order to be able to anticipate, make decisions, react, and ultimately to perform better. Well, this started me thinking about not so much soccer, but how this might relate to tennis. You know, in tennis, the return of serve is a very quick, fast motion, and there are also a number of shots that can be disguised in tennis, one being the drop shot. And I started thinking back to coaching and being on the court and thought about this one particular situation where I was coaching this 16-year-old girl who was nationally ranked. I was probably double her age at the time I was coaching her. She was faster than me at that time, stronger than me, hit the ball harder than me. And I remember after one lesson, at the end of the lesson, what we would always do is we would play out some points. And so she served to me, and I hit a drop shot. And she stood there like, what was that? Flat-footed, not expecting that. So we went on to the other side of the court, played the second point. I did the same thing, and she did the same response. This went on for point 3 and point 4, and I broke her serve, and she broke her racket. And it really made me think, you know, how is it that she, even after that amount of repetitions, was not able to pick up that I was going to do a drop shot? And the reason is that although she was biomechanically sound, although she was strong, although she was fast, she was not looking at the right spots in order to be able to anticipate what was coming next. And so this led into my dissertation at the time, which was to examine where tennis players were looking when they were returning serve. 2 different skill levels, professional tennis players and semi-professional tennis players, as well as wheelchair tennis players, experienced and less experienced. And what I found through that dissertation research is the same thing that the soccer researchers found, which is that the most experienced tennis players look in the same spots every single time when they're returning serve. They look at things like the rotation of the body, for example, to determine the direction the ball goes. They do that every single time with the same routine, and they know not only to look there, but what information to pick up from where they look. Less experienced players don't do that. They tend to look more varied, in different areas, don't have the same routines. What we found in terms of the wheelchair tennis players was very interesting. Based on their past experience, whether they had played tennis as an able-bodied athlete prior to playing wheelchair tennis, would determine where their visual cues were. And it would take them a period of time to be able to adapt to wheelchair tennis. If you think about playing tennis from a wheelchair, first of all, it's extremely difficult. But second of all, your visual perspective is very different. When you're standing up, you're looking over the net and down to the cues. When you're sitting down, you're looking through the net. And the cues are different. So based on their past experiences, they would look in different places, and it would take them a time to adapt. And therefore, their performance would have to adapt over that period of time as well, because the cues aren't necessarily the same in wheelchair tennis as they are in able-bodied tennis. And that's what the dissertation found as well. After this, I started getting some requests to work in some other sports. Now again, I'm from Australia, I know very little about baseball. If it was cricket, we would have been good, but what I do know, obviously though, is that if you are a batter, a hitter, looking towards a pitcher, you have very little time, less than half a second, about 400 milliseconds at a 95-mile-an-hour fastball, between the release point and the time that the ball goes over the plate. Now, that's simply mathematically not enough time to do everything that you need to do to be able to connect ball and bat. So what does that mean? What it means is, to give yourself more time, you have to look at the right cues before the release point in order to be able to anticipate, make a decision, and determine if you're going to swing the bat or not, and how you're going to swing that bat. So, a Major League Baseball team asked me to come in and look at where their minor league players were looking when they were at bat compared to where their major league players were looking when they were at bat. And what this slide is a representation of eye-tracking glasses, where they were using the eye-tracking glasses in the batting box, and the batter's looking out into the perspective of towards the pitcher. The red boxes is an average of where their gaze was in those 5 different biomechanical phases. Does that make sense? Okay. So what you see is when they're setting up in the first box, it's very large. They're looking anywhere on the pitcher, okay, even at the feet, even at the ground. Okay? As the pitch progresses, they look at half the pitcher and they start to try to narrow their focus a little bit. Okay? This was an average of 55 minor league players. Now let me show you where the major league players looked. All right? Minor league, major league. No pun intended, but the visual differences are extraordinary. Okay? Why does this matter? It affects their decision-making, their prediction, their ability to make contact. It affects their performance statistics, and I'll explain that as we go a little further. Okay? As I started looking at these things in different sports and looking at this eye-tracking video, I noticed some other things that were happening. The first thing that I noticed is that in this video, what you'd see is you would see prior to the batter, performing the swing, prior to the pitcher doing their pitch, as they stepped up onto the mound, what they would do is they would look at a near target, like their hands or the bat or the plate, and then they would look at a far target, such as the pitcher or first base or somewhere out in the field. And then they would come back and look at a near target, and then they would look again at a far target, okay? And I noticed this time and again. So we started to explore these videos again from this perspective. And what we found was that the athletes that had a higher batting average, a better slugging percentage, and a better on-base percentage actually looked near, far between 2 and 3 times prior to swinging the bat. Players that had lower statistics either did this less than 2 times or greater than 3 times. So they either didn't have much of a routine or they kind of got stuck in a routine. And this was really interesting because it related directly to the performance statistics. Depending on who I speak to about why this might occur, depends on the response I get. For example, if I speak to some of my sports psychology colleagues, they will say the reason that the athlete is doing this is because they're doing it as part of their pre-performance routine to reduce stress. If I speak to an optometry doctor, they'll say it's because they're warming up their eyes for near and far focusing. From a coaching perspective and an athlete perspective, I'm not sure they really care why they're doing it. They just know that this is something that impacts their ability to perform, and that the performance statistics show that out, bear that to be. The other concept that we noticed as we were looking through these videos is head tilt. And I know this is a very familiar concept for all of you. And what we noticed is that the minor league players would tilt their head like this when looking out towards the L frame or the coach, the pitcher. Whereas the major league players would have a very stable line of gaze. Why does that matter? Well, when looking at some of the research around head tilt and performance, what we actually see is that when you tilt your head beyond a certain degree, it affects your depth perception. Depth perception is very important, obviously, in order to be able to time the interaction between bat and ball. So, knowing this as a factor to be able to determine level of performance became a very important issue for the coaches and the players, and actually affected things like discipline at the plate, whether they swung or they didn't swing, for example. So, as I was working with some of these groups, these sports organizations, I also ended up working with some military organizations. And what became very obvious is that this information, although very valuable, I think Dr. Carrick mentioned it in the introduction, is not necessarily very scalable, meaning that for me to analyze my dissertation took 3 months, 18 hours a day. And so if you have to wait for that kind of information to see where your performance is, the season could be over. In working with Special Operations Command, as they're clearing a building, they want to know right away, did a person miss a cue? Right? They don't want to wait 3 months. That's just completely impractical. And so what we started to realize is that we really needed to do some cloud-based immediate analytics. So now, what used to take me 3 months to do can actually be done in less than, in a millisecond, fractions of a millisecond. And that's all because of cloud-based analytics now. The third thing that kind of was an aha moment for me, and I obviously need a lot of these, but is that I had one of the coaches come to me, one of the baseball coaches that I initially worked with, and he said, I have this athlete, he's again, biomechanically really good, physically strong, healthy, but he just keeps swinging at these pitches that he shouldn't be swinging at. He goes, I don't know what's going on. I even took him to an optometrist, and in typical coaching language said, he read that charty thing and he did fine. He got 20/10. So his vision is good. I said, okay. He said, can you take a look at him and see, if you can figure out what's going on? So replicated the static visual acuity Snellen chart. He also got 20/10 on that. And then I ran a dynamic visual acuity test. And he got 2400, which is legally blind, right? And so if baseball was T-ball and the ball didn't move, this AAA athlete probably would have been fine. And for me at that time, I was blown away. Frankly, I couldn't figure out initially what was going on, And over time, and since that time, obviously realized that, dynamic visual acuity is processed and looked at and understood from a neuroscience perspective in a very different way than static visual acuity. So it made sense that one could be completely okay, even really good, and the other could not be. What it also told me, though, is that although I was looking at visual cues, where people look at certain biomechanical phases, which in my world is known as visual search, and we were looking at some of the basic fundamentals of vision, static visual acuity, we did not have a good comprehensive model for understanding sports vision. And so what that led to was the development of such a model, where we started off by looking at the base functional issues in vision, things like acuity, dynamic and static, stability, fixation stability, which obviously relates then to some balance issues and other things, contrast sensitivity. Moving up the chain, looking at things like mechanics. Are the eyes working well together? Are they teaming? Is there good depth perception? Moving further up the chain, not only what happens with actually the eye, but how that information is then processed in the brain. How is the person processing the information, making decisions, reacting, and responding? And then ultimately, the on-field work, which is, is this person distracted? Is this person impulsive? Now, this model is not a model where we look at these different areas independently. If you have a problem at any one of these levels, it will likely affect up and down the chain, right? So that was a really important discovery. We ended up doing quite a bit of research around that. Again, some of this research and the results that I thought we were going to get, we did not end up getting, and surprised me. Things such as, athletes, although they had good reaction time and better reaction time than the everyday person, some of the things that we were able to discover through the eye tracking data is that we're not just looking at a motor response, but we're also looking at what happens prior to the motor response with the eye movements that may be very different than what we expected, okay? So ultimately, all of these kind of aha moments for me came down to data. I've been proven wrong many times and will continue to be proven wrong, so it's all about the data for me. And what that means is, a person sits down in front of a system, we take their eye movement data, we save that raw data, we develop metrics from that data such as percentages and averages and things like that then gets developed into further algorithms and models. And I'll go over one of those models in just a moment. But in order for us to actually be able to have confidence in the data, we needed to make sure that we met certain high scientific standards, such as reliability. If I take a test right now, and I take a test 5 minutes from now, assuming I don't fall off the stage and hit my head, the result should be the same. right? So consistency of the data, okay? Validity. If there is some other tool out there that's comparable, if I get result A with that tool, I should also get result A with the eye tracking tool. So making sure there's consistency in that output. Accuracy. If I say that a person is classified in a specific group, then we want to make sure that that accuracy is at least, if not better than 90%. For reliability, we use a Cronbach alpha of greater than 0.8%. 0.8, I'm sorry. Drilling down further into the analytics, we look at things like the sensitivity, specificity, ROC curves, and regressions to be able to model out that data so that we're not just looking at independent metrics, but we're looking at a collection of metrics that make up a profile for a specific type of person. And I'll go over that in just a moment. But essentially, this led again to some fundamental kind of research on reliability and validity. This is one of the papers that we put out in the ARVO journal TVST, looking at pupil size, pupil diameter, reliability of that, and validity of that. And you can see that those numbers are 0.996 and so on. So highly, highly reliable. How is this information then being used? It's really being used by coaches and athletes and organizations in 4 different ways right now. First way is scouting. Every organization wants to understand more about the athletes that they're getting. It doesn't mean that if a person has a vision problem, they're going to say, no, goodbye. But they're at least going to know about it, and they're going to be able to do something to help that athlete if they bring them on board. So it's awareness. Number 2 is baselining. Understanding where a person starts. You know, there are studies that we're currently got ongoing looking at fatigue over a season. For example, looking at what happens between the baseline and if somebody ends up having a traumatic brain injury. Okay, so starting off with baselining. Training. Many of these things can be trained and improved. So looking at the gap between where a person is and where we want that athlete to be, and bridging that gap. There's also some work that's currently being done on injury prevention. So with pitchers in baseball, over 1/3 of the injuries they have actually come from the batter and the ball coming off the batter and hitting them. And part of that information is if we can know where they're looking and how they're reacting, we might be able to help reduce that injury rate. That's one example. Back to this modeling and profiling. So by taking all of this data, developing the metrics, developing the algorithms, using things like regression, what we do is we come up with a model that basically shows the difference between a particular group. In this case, I'm going to talk about Major League Baseball players compared to everybody else. So for example, we have 660 metrics in our database right now. Using regressions and modeling, only 11 of those metrics differentiate Major League Baseball players from everybody else. The only way for us to get to the answers of to get to those answers is to use big data analytics and modeling. There's no way I would have been able to predict which 11 variables matter and at what weighting they matter. But they absolutely do matter. And they matter to everybody because what you can see on the slide here under hitting statistics is that these visual concepts relate to performance statistics, batting average, on-base percentage, slugging percentage, and on-base plus slugging percentage, and we have an article coming out very shortly on swing chase probability as well. That information is very important to coaches, to athletes, and to being able to understand the vision of these athletes and how it impacts their performance. So up until this point, what I've really highlighted is what I would consider an assumption that the athlete is functional and is looking to be exceptional. So a good to great model. However, that assumption may not be correct. What I mean by that is that not only are athletes who may be very strong and biomechanically sound and all those other things, they may not have great eyesight. We found that out from the athlete who came and had 2,400 dynamic visual acuity. And so it started me down the line of questioning, what about dysfunctionality? And for some of the eye tracking tests, in this case, we're looking at smooth pursuits where, a person's eye is supposed to be following a target up and down on a screen, and it should look like what's under the functional there. But in some cases, it clearly looks dysfunctional. And this is not just athletes, but it's the general population as well. So the eyes are not working well together in an elevated plane in this case. But what about this one? This one also looks dysfunctional, but maybe not as much as the other. What about this one? And how about this one? And what I had initially assumed was that I could categorize people, and you probably laugh at this, but as functional or dysfunctional. I had a lot to learn. And by looking at this data, and we looked at hundreds and hundreds of cases, it actually started me questioning, is that the right approach? Here's an example on a horizontal saccade test. The one that you see under functional looks pretty normal. You should be going straight back and forth. You should be targeting. Obviously, this one doesn't look functional. It looks dysfunctional. This person actually had a traumatic brain injury and was in a car accident. What about this one? 3 out of 4 of the targets look pretty good. How do I classify that? And this one? And this one? So as you can see, I got more and more questions and had more questions than answers. And finally, looking at some of the fixation information. Fixations when looking at a target should be fairly stable, not spread out. Clearly, this person under the dysfunctional couldn't fixate whatsoever. That's a clear differentiation. What about this person? More questions. More questions than answers. So it really led me to ask the question, what is normal? What is functional? And so obviously I went back to the literature. And in going back to the literature, I was trying to see if there was any information out there on developmental data of eye tracking across the lifespan. And there wasn't. So we use the data that we have, which is now 150,000 tests and over 1 billion data points, to be able to look at all sorts of different demographics and cluster analysis based on ages to determine what is so-called functional for certain age groups across the lifespan. So we had something to compare to, because that just simply didn't exist. The second thing that I realized after looking at all of this is that my approach was actually faulty. I couldn't classify people as functional or dysfunctional. I couldn't check this box or that box. Instead, eye movement behavior is really on a scale of functionality. Looking at all of those pictures I showed you before, it's just not simply good enough to say you're good or you're not good. And frankly, it also depends on what the person is what their lifestyle and their expectations are. So for example, when using this scale, if I go back to that 22-year-old AAA baseball player, his goal is not going to be to just be functional. His goal is to get all the way to green and be exceptional, right? Because he wants to be the best that he can be at this particular sport, and that requires him to be exceptional. If I take a 70-year-old who is trying to determine, for example, if they can drive at night, their goal is to be able to get into their age-based functional area. So based on lifestyle questions, that's another area where we needed to really consider. It's not just functional or dysfunctional, but it's also lifestyle issues. It has to be practical. This again led to a paper that we used all of our data, developed cluster analysis, and was able to look at where people fall on the scale based on their age group, so we had some kind of comparison. As part of being able to do this in a reliable way, we needed to make sure that people were setting their system up correctly, and we were gathering data in a way that was enabling the results to be reliable. So some of the things that we made sure we were doing was not using wheels on the chairs, because that would just promote a lot of movement that was excessive. We also wanted to make sure that we had the person sat in their chair first and then adjusted the table for them so that they were comfortable, and we moved the environment around them, okay? We also we made some changes to calibration. So making sure that people knew the distance that they were sitting at from the device, and checking the distance before every test. We also, in the background, use a lot of what's called error proofing. So for example, if we get data and we don't have enough data from a test, or the data looks funny in some way, it's not coming out outside of what we would expect, then we will kick that back immediately and say, hey, check your setup. Let's just make sure that you're sitting at the right distance so that we can actually get the data we need to be reliable and accurate. And that's, quite frankly, that's quite a challenge, because we have people of all different demographics, ages, genders, ethnicities. So it's something that we have to build into the system and make sure that we adjust the environment around the person being tested. One of the things that we also realized over time is that we needed to continue to develop. And one of the things that we thought, especially for this group, that would be valuable is to develop a right eye saccadimetry test. So using stimuli where you've got a horizontal random saccade that's 180 seconds of duration and 120 saccades, we wanted to make sure that we were able to do that reliably, and so ran Cronbach alphas on that with an average of 0.85. We also wanted to make sure that we provided the information that will be supplemental to your clinical decision making, but velocity and time graphs, latency graphs that we know are important, phase graphs, and also looking from left to right, some of the bar graphs that relate to amplitude, duration, latency, and number of saccades that you're used to seeing, as well as others like Q ratio. So the general theme of my talk is it's all about the data, and that I've learned a lot on my 20-year journey looking at the data. I will continue to learn, and we'll continue, I think, to innovate using other methods to look at this data, things like object recognition, additional machine learning techniques, big data analytics, where we can look at the data, truly understand it, be able to develop models and indicators, and ultimately diagnostics. The goal that I have is to be able to complement already the work, the tremendous amount of work that you have as clinicians, and the experience that you have as clinicians, that I find I have high respect for, to complement that, and to be very specific and reliable so that you have something that's quantitative that you can take and show to a patient, and you can make decisions on what to do next. Ultimately, our goal is to create what we call a data discovery platform, which is to take all of this big data and be able to put it in an environment where we can explore it. And we can try to find out things that we don't know, that we don't even know that we don't know at this point, in order to be able to help people, in order to be able to advance the science and the research in this area. That's all I have for right now. Thank you so much for listening.